Have you ever wondered what really happens inside the mind of an avoidant person after they lose someone who truly loved them? Not someone ordinary, not someone temporary, but someone patient, someone who stayed when things were difficult, someone who loved them in a way that felt rare, honest, and real. Most people believe avoidant individuals simply walk away and forget. They assume that once distance is created, the story ends there. But human psychology tells a very different story. What looks like indifference on the outside often hides a silent emotional process on the inside, a process that takes time, a process that most people never see. And by the end of this video, you will understand something powerful about avoidant behavior that very few people talk about. You will understand what truly happens after the silence begins. When someone who deeply loved an avoidant person finally walks away, the first reaction is not always sadness. In fact, the first feeling is often something unexpected. Relief, a quiet sense of space, no more emotional pressure, no more difficult conversations, no more moments where they feel pushed to open their heart. For a short time, the mind of an avoidant person feels lighter, their world becomes calm again. The emotional intensity that once surrounded them suddenly disappears, and to them that calm can feel like freedom. But here is something important about the avoidant mind that many people misunderstand. Avoidant individuals are not emotionless. They are not heartless. They are not incapable of love. Their mind simply learned, often very early in life, that emotional closeness can feel overwhelming, that vulnerability can lead to pain, that relying on someone emotionally can feel dangerous. So they built a quiet survival strategy: distance, control, independence, walls that protect them from feeling too much. These walls become part of their identity. They become a way of navigating relationships without feeling emotionally trapped. When someone gets too close, the avoidant instinct begins to activate, a subtle urge to step back, a quiet need for space, a feeling that things are becoming too intense. And when this happens, the avoidant mind often chooses distance over connection. Not because they do not care, but because their nervous system interprets closeness as pressure. So when the person who truly loved them finally leaves, something strange happens. At first, the avoidant mind believes the problem has been solved. The pressure is gone. The expectations disappear. The emotional intensity fades away. Life returns to a familiar rhythm of independence and control. For a moment, everything feels manageable again. But human emotions are not that simple. Silence has a way of revealing things that noise hides. Days begin to pass, then weeks. The space that once felt comfortable slowly begins to feel different. Something subtle begins to change inside the avoidant mind. The calm starts to feel a little too quiet. The independence starts to feel a little too empty, because something important is no longer there. The person who once cared deeply, the person who once stayed patient during the emotional distance, the person who kept showing love even when it was not always returned in the same way. Avoidant individuals rarely process emotional loss immediately. Their brain is wired to delay emotional confrontation. Instead of facing the feeling directly, the mind distracts itself. Work becomes busier. Daily routines become louder. Conversations with friends become a way to fill the silence. But the human mind cannot escape emotional truth forever. Eventually, memories begin to surface. Not dramatic memories, not loud memories, quiet ones, small moments that once seemed ordinary, a supportive message during a difficult day, a calm voice during an argument, a moment when someone looked at them with genuine care. These memories begin to appear slowly, almost like whispers from the past, and with each memory, a subtle realization begins to grow. Not everyone loves that deeply. Not everyone stays that patiently. Not everyone is willing to understand someone who struggles to express emotions. And that realization can feel unsettling, because deep inside, the avoidant mind begins to recognize something it tried not to see before. That person was not just another relationship. That person was someone rare, someone who saw past the walls, someone who stayed even when connection was difficult, someone who believed there was more inside the avoidant heart than what was visible on the surface. This is where the silence begins to change its meaning. At first, it felt like freedom. Now it begins to feel like absence, a quiet space where someone important used to be. And the avoidant mind, which once believed distance was the safest choice, slowly begins to question something it had always assumed was true. What if pushing people away was never protection? What if it was fear? Fear of being seen too deeply, fear of depending on someone emotionally, fear of discovering that real love requires vulnerability. Because vulnerability is something avoidant individuals spend their whole life trying to avoid, not because they are weak, but because their mind learned long ago that emotional exposure can lead to pain. But here is the paradox of human connection. The very thing we try to avoid is often the thing that gives life meaning. Real connection does not exist without emotional openness. Real love does not grow in emotional distance, and when someone who truly loved them disappears, the avoidant person is left alone with a question that slowly begins to grow louder inside their mind. Was that distance really necessary? Or did it cost them something irreplaceable? This question does not arrive immediately. It grows quietly over time, and when it finally reaches the surface of awareness, it begins a psychological process that most people never see happening inside an avoidant mind. A process of reflection, a process of emotional awakening, a process that can completely change how they understand love, connection, and themselves. And what happens next is something very few people truly understand. Because the moment an avoidant person begins to realize what they lost, the emotional journey becomes far more complex than anyone expects. Time keeps moving, but inside the avoidant mind, something unusual begins to unfold. The quiet space that once felt comfortable slowly turns into a place of reflection. At first, the thoughts arrive softly. They appear during ordinary moments, while walking alone, while sitting in a quiet room, while looking at something that suddenly reminds them of the person who used to be there. The mind starts replaying fragments of the past, not the dramatic parts, not the arguments. Instead, it remembers the small details that once felt ordinary, but now carry a different weight. The patience, the kindness, the way that person stayed calm when things became emotionally difficult. These memories begin to surface like pieces of a puzzle that were ignored before. Avoidant individuals often convince themselves that emotional closeness limits their freedom. Their thinking tells them that relationships bring expectations they cannot handle. So when the relationship ended, their mind quickly created a story that made the separation seem logical. They told themselves that things were too intense, that distance was necessary, that life would become easier without emotional pressure. But the human brain has a powerful way of correcting false narratives over time. When the environment becomes quiet and distractions fade, deeper thoughts begin to rise. Slowly, the avoidant mind starts seeing the relationship from a different angle. The distance that once felt like protection begins to look more like avoidance. The decision that once seemed rational starts to feel incomplete. This is where delayed awareness begins. Unlike people who process emotions immediately, avoidant personalities experience feelings in a slower and more indirect way. Their emotional system works like a locked door that only opens after time has passed. At first, the door stays closed, but the longer the silence continues, the more pressure builds behind it. Eventually, curiosity enters the picture. They begin asking questions they never asked before. Why did that person stay so long? Why were they willing to be patient during difficult moments? Why did they continue offering care even when emotional distance existed? These questions start to reshape the avoidant perspective. Because something begins to become clear. That person was not trying to control them. They were trying to understand them. This realization can be uncomfortable. It forces the avoidant mind to face something unfamiliar. The possibility that the relationship was not a threat. The possibility that someone genuinely wanted connection without taking away independence. This idea challenges the defensive patterns that have been used for years. With this new awareness, regret slowly begins to form. Regret does not arrive loudly. It does not appear as a sudden emotional breakdown. Instead, it grows quietly through repeated thoughts. The mind starts comparing past moments with the present reality. They begin noticing the difference between someone who truly cared and the absence that replaced them. Human psychology explains that people often recognize value only after distance is created. When something is consistently present, the brain adapts to it. It becomes normal, expected. But once it disappears, the brain suddenly notices the gap it left behind. This is exactly what begins happening inside the avoidant mind. The presence of genuine affection is no longer there. The supportive messages are gone. The person who once offered understanding during confusing emotional moments is no longer part of daily life. What remains is a quiet awareness that something meaningful existed, something that cannot easily be replaced. Avoidant individuals rarely express this realization openly. Their personality structure encourages internal processing rather than outward expression. They might continue appearing calm on the outside. Friends may see them living normally. Conversations may sound relaxed and casual, but inside, their thoughts begin moving in a different direction. They start questioning past choices. They begin examining moments where they created emotional distance. They remember times when someone tried to communicate honestly, yet they responded by withdrawing. These memories slowly build a clearer picture of what actually happened. For the first time, the avoidant person may start recognizing the effort that the other person invested in the relationship, the emotional patience, the willingness to stay even when connection required more understanding. This awareness can feel heavy because it reveals something difficult to accept. They were loved more deeply than they realized. And this realization introduces a powerful psychological shift. Instead of focusing on what the relationship demanded from them, the avoidant mind begins focusing on what the relationship offered: safety, acceptance, emotional consistency. These qualities are rare, and when someone finally sees their value, the absence becomes impossible to ignore. The brain begins imagining alternative outcomes. It wonders how things might have unfolded if certain moments had been handled differently. What if they had stayed during emotional conversations instead of pulling away? What if they had allowed themselves to express feelings instead of hiding them? These reflections are not about blaming themselves completely. They are about understanding what was happening beneath their own behavior. This is the moment when the avoidant person begins to see their patterns more clearly. The walls they built were designed to prevent emotional overwhelm, but those same walls also prevented deeper connection. The protective system that once seemed necessary begins to look like a barrier that blocked something meaningful from growing. Understanding this truth does not immediately change their personality. Growth rarely happens overnight. But awareness is the first step toward transformation. Once the avoidant mind starts recognizing the role fear played in the relationship, a new emotional layer begins to develop. The silence that once felt comfortable now becomes a place of reflection. And within that reflection, a deeper question slowly takes shape. Did they walk away from pressure? Once this realization begins to settle in, the inner world of an avoidant person becomes far more complicated than anyone on the outside can see. A quiet struggle begins inside their mind. Not a loud battle, but a slow and constant tension between two powerful instincts. One part of them begins to feel the pull of connection. Another part still clings to the habit of emotional distance that has protected them for so many years. This is where the real conflict begins. The memory of that person who once cared deeply does not simply disappear. It returns in unexpected ways. Sometimes it arrives through a simple reminder: a place they once visited together, a song they once heard, a thought that suddenly brings back the feeling of being understood by someone who was patient enough to stay during their emotional distance. These reminders do not shout for attention. They appear quietly, but their impact grows stronger each time they return. Inside the avoidant mind, two voices slowly begin to form. One voice speaks from a place of longing. It asks questions that were never asked before. What if that person was truly different from everyone else? What if the connection they offered was genuine and rare? What if the emotional safety they once provided was something that may not appear again easily in life? This voice begins to challenge the avoidant belief system. It gently pushes against the idea that closeness always leads to pressure. It introduces a new possibility: that emotional connection does not have to destroy independence, that someone can care deeply without taking away personal freedom. These thoughts begin to reshape how the past relationship is remembered. But another voice quickly appears to resist this shift. This second voice speaks from habit, from the old survival patterns that have guided the avoidant personality for years. It reminds them of the moments when emotions felt overwhelming. It brings back memories of uncomfortable conversations, moments when vulnerability felt unfamiliar, moments when they felt exposed and uncertain. This voice argues that distance was necessary, that stepping away protected their sense of control. These two internal perspectives create a powerful emotional tension. One side begins to wonder whether reaching out would bring clarity, whether a conversation might reveal that the connection was still possible, whether honesty might repair something that was broken, but the other side warns about the risks. It reminds them that opening the door to emotional closeness might bring discomfort again. It suggests that maintaining distance keeps life predictable and safe. For many avoidant individuals, this internal dialogue can continue for a long time. They move forward with their daily routine, but the question remains quietly active beneath the surface. It appears during moments of reflection. It returns during nights when the world becomes silent. It stays present in the background of their thoughts, slowly shaping how they understand their past behavior. Human psychology shows that emotional growth often begins with awareness of patterns. And this is exactly what starts happening within the avoidant mind. As they reflect more deeply, they begin noticing something important about their own actions, a pattern that repeated itself not only in this relationship, but often in others as well. Whenever emotional closeness increased, they felt the urge to step back. Whenever someone tried to move the relationship toward deeper understanding, they felt pressure building inside. Their reaction was not intentional cruelty. It was a protective response created by years of emotional conditioning. The mind had learned to associate vulnerability with risk, so distance became the automatic solution. But now, with the absence of someone who genuinely cared, that protective response begins to look different. The strategy that once felt necessary now appears incomplete. It kept them safe from discomfort, but it also kept them separated from deeper connection. This recognition can be difficult to accept. It requires a level of honesty that avoidant individuals are not always used to practicing with themselves. They must acknowledge that the emotional walls they built did not only block pain, they also blocked intimacy, trust, and the possibility of experiencing a relationship where both people grow together. For the first time, the avoidant person may begin to understand something powerful about emotional courage. True strength in relationships is not found in constant independence. It is found in the ability to stay present even when emotions feel unfamiliar. It is found in the willingness to communicate honestly instead of retreating into silence. It is found in the courage to allow another person to see parts of the heart that usually remain hidden. This understanding slowly reshapes how they view the person they lost. Instead of remembering them as someone who demanded too much, they begin seeing them as someone who was simply asking for closeness, someone who believed the relationship could grow stronger through openness, someone who was willing to stand beside them while they learned how to navigate emotional connection. With this new perspective, a deeper feeling begins to appear. Not only regret, but respect. Respect for the patience that person once showed. Respect for the emotional effort they invested. Respect for the way they tried to create a bond that was built on honesty and care. This respect can become the seed of change, because once someone begins to recognize the value of what they lost, their understanding of future relationships begins to shift. The avoidant mind starts to question whether the old patterns should continue controlling every connection. It begins wondering whether growth is possible, whether emotional openness could lead to something meaningful instead of something threatening. The silence that once existed after the separation now holds a different purpose. It becomes a space where self-awareness slowly develops. As this understanding grows deeper, something begins to change inside the avoidant person. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly. Almost quietly, like the first light that appears before sunrise. The mind begins to look at life with a new kind of honesty, a level of awareness that did not exist before. For a long time, emotional distance felt like strength. It felt like control, it felt like independence. But now the avoidant person starts to recognize something important. The habit of keeping people at arm's length did not only prevent emotional overwhelm, it also prevented them from experiencing the depth of connection that makes relationships meaningful. This realization can be uncomfortable because it requires them to face a difficult truth. The person who once cared deeply was not the problem. The real struggle existed within their own emotional defenses. Human behavior often follows familiar patterns. When the mind learns a way to protect itself, it continues repeating that behavior even when the situation changes. The avoidant individual may have learned early in life that emotional closeness brought confusion or disappointment. As a result, their instinct became simple: stay independent, stay self-reliant. Do not allow anyone to get too close. This strategy may have worked for survival in the past. But when someone sincere entered their life, that same strategy created distance where understanding could have grown. The person who offered patience and care was not trying to take away freedom. They were simply trying to build trust. Now, with time passing and silence providing space for reflection, the avoidant mind begins to recognize the difference. They start noticing something powerful about genuine love. Real connection does not demand perfection. It does not require constant emotional performance. Instead, it grows through mutual effort, through communication, through the willingness to stay present even when feelings become complicated. The person they lost understood this. That is why they stayed during moments when emotional distance appeared. That is why they continued offering kindness when responses were sometimes quiet or uncertain. Their patience was not weakness. It was a reflection of sincere care. This awareness creates a shift in how the avoidant person views their past relationship. Instead of remembering it as something overwhelming, they begin to see it as an opportunity they did not fully understand at the time. An opportunity to experience trust without losing individuality. An opportunity to grow emotionally alongside someone who genuinely wanted the connection to succeed. Many people move through life believing that meaningful love will appear again and again, but reality often proves otherwise. Deep emotional understanding between two people is rare. It requires patience, empathy, and a willingness to accept each other's imperfections. When the avoidant mind realizes this, a new feeling begins to take shape. Gratitude. Gratitude for the moments that once existed. Gratitude for the lessons that relationship revealed. Even though the connection ended, its impact continues shaping how they see themselves and others. Sometimes the most powerful teachers in life are the people who cared enough to show us parts of ourselves we had never examined before. The avoidant person may begin thinking differently about future relationships. The old pattern of immediate distance begins to lose its certainty. They start asking themselves new questions. What would happen if they allowed someone to know them more honestly? What would happen if they remained present during emotional conversations instead of stepping away? These questions represent growth. They show that the avoidant mind is beginning to explore possibilities that once felt uncomfortable. Change does not mean becoming a completely different person overnight. Personal transformation rarely happens that way. Instead, it unfolds through small moments of awareness, through the courage to pause and reflect before repeating old habits. The memory of the person who once loved them becomes part of this process, not as a source of endless regret, but as a reminder of what genuine care looks like. That memory quietly encourages the avoidant individual to reconsider the walls they built around their emotions, because eventually, a deeper realization begins to appear. The greatest risk in relationships is not vulnerability. The greatest risk is never allowing yourself to experience closeness at all. Life is full of opportunities for connection, but those opportunities require emotional openness. They require the willingness to share thoughts and feelings honestly. They require the courage to let another person see the real parts of who we are. The avoidant individual slowly begins to understand that independence and connection do not have to exist as opposites. Both can exist together when there is trust. Both can grow when communication replaces silence. And this awareness becomes a powerful turning point. The person they lost may never return. Time often moves forward without giving second chances, but the lesson that relationship created remains valuable. It becomes a guide for how they approach future connections. A reminder that emotional safety grows through honesty rather than distance. Every human being carries the ability to learn from experience, even those who once believed that keeping their heart guarded was the safest way to live. When understanding replaces fear, new possibilities begin to appear. The avoidant person who once believed distance was the only way to protect themselves now begins to see another path. A path where strength is measured not by how far we keep others away, but by how bravely we allow meaningful relationships to grow.